Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it. This story begins the way so many ordinary days do, with work, routine, and responsibility. One day belongs to a Black woman earning her living. The other day belongs to an elderly man consumed by fear. Now, neither one of them woke up knowing that their paths would collide, but of course they do. And neither one knew that one of their lives would end that day. Let's dive into a little bit more about each person. LoLetha Hall was a mother. She was a grandmother, a cook, and a woman known for warmth and conversation. She lived in Ohio after returning from North Carolina, where she had built a life rooted in public service, behavioral health work, and community. She was in her retirement era and she decided she wanted to drive for Uber. Now, this was not just like something she did for excitement. She did it because she needed to earn an income. That morning, she logged into her app, just like she had countless days before. She accepted a request to pick up a package and deliver it to another location. She had no way of knowing that doing her job would place her in danger.
William Brock was 83 years old. He lived in rural Ohio. That same day, he received a series of terrifying phone calls. The callers used artificial intelligence and impersonation tactics to convince him that his grandson was in danger. They told him his grandson had hit a pregnant woman with his truck and they needed $12,000 in cash to bail him out of jail that day because the judge was going on vacation. They gave him a case number, which he wrote down in a notebook. Mr. Brock also spoke to someone he believed was his grandson. After a while, on the phone, things started to unravel when Mr. Brock asked the scammers for his grandson's full name and the call went silent. Mr. Brock then asked what kind of truck his grandson was driving. And the scammer said it was a Ford pickup. Mr. Brock knew his grandson drove a semi trailer. He told the people on the phone they had the wrong man, and the call immediately took a menacing turn. A real loud, vicious sounding voice started shouting and telling Mr. Brock time is up. The caller vowed to kill Mr. Brock and his family if he did not give the woman who was sitting in the car outside his house $12,000. The caller assured Mr. Brock that he would follow through on the threats if the woman in the car called to say she had not received the money. This is not a game, the caller told Mr. Brock. The calls escalated in urgency and threat. Fear took hold. Brock believed he was being targeted and that someone was coming to his home. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. You can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back, and this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story.
Uber request that LoLetha Hall accepted brought her directly to Brock's property. Now, she too was scammed by the scammers. Unbeknownst to her, she was told to arrive at Brock's house and pick up a package that she was instructed to then deliver to another location. Now, Steph's like, that's a little interesting to me. I've never driven Ubers, but I wanted to ask you, do you know if that's commonplace for Uber? In my mind, I called an Uber to simply pick me up, take me to another location. Is it common, to your knowledge, that an Uber driver could pick up a package and then deliver it to another location?
I haven't heard picking up a package before. Picking up somebody else, yes, but picking up a package, that's not something that I'm familiar with.
Well, Lolita arrived at Brock's house. She was unarmed. She knocked on the door and she identified herself and she attempted to explain why she was there. But according to Brock, when he opened the door, he was in absolute fear. Here was the woman that the callers promised would show up and standing on his front door, no less, requesting the very thing that they said she would request. So fear took hold and he pointed his gun at her and demanded that she give him her phone. And the reason he wanted her to give him his phone is because if she made the call saying, "Hey, I didn't get the package you told me I was supposed to get," then he feared that they would then come and kill him.
Lolita attempts to flee to her vehicle. She just wants to leave. This is not what she signed up for. This is not an ordinary day. This is starting to be a nightmare. And this was an Uber gone wrong, to say the very least. She absolutely knew she needed to escape. As she began her pursuit back to her vehicle, Brock is following closely behind her. There is dash cam footage that shows Brock following behind her with his gun. That's right, this whole exchange is caught on dash cam video that Lolita had in her car as protocol. Some dashers do that. Not all dashers have dash cam footage. But I've seen some in videos. I haven't ever experienced the Uber driver having one in the car that I've been in, but I've seen some people, and I think it's just extra precaution. Honestly, I think everybody should probably do it. Honestly, I feel like that should probably be protocol. Nevertheless, Lolita was in trying to make her way back to her car. Everything is being followed through her dash cam. And you can see Brock pointing a revolver at Lolita and following her as she walks away from him toward her car. Her face is stricken with fear, as you can imagine. And she's just saying to him, "I'm just trying to pick up a package." He replies, "Yeah, I know what you're after." He threatens to shoot her in the head and she begs him not to. He demands to know who she's working for, and she explains to him that she works for Uber. Brock refused to let Lolita drive away and shot her 6 times and then called 911. When the authorities arrived, they treated Lolita in the driveway and flew her to a hospital where she was later pronounced dead. One of the scammers called Brock on his phone as the police were on scene. A detective answered Brock's phone and recorded the conversation with the scammer, who claimed that he was a police officer and added, "You're going to be in trouble," according to the body camera footage. This is not a case of who done it, it's whether or not the person that did it is liable. So the question becomes, was this shooting justified? Was Brock within his rights to defend himself when he shot and killed Lolita?
And Steph, I just think it's really interesting that here this case is centered also around these scammers. And I don't want to miss that because while we're gonna discuss, whether or not the shooting was justified, I also want to have this conversation with you just about the development of AI, the just prevalence of scammers calling, pretending to be other people, using that person's voice to even convince you that it really is that person. I just want to get your thoughts on that. And I also want to just add before you get your thoughts that I think it's interesting that they targeted somebody that was elderly, right? This guy was in his 80s, but he had you could tell his instincts, his gut felt like something's off here, right? Because he then asked them, like, "Well, what does my grandson drive? Right? What's his full name?" So you can see he's probing, and yet still he fell somewhat for the trap. What do you think about this?
Well, so that's two questions. So I think what I've noticed in the emergence of AI is that you have to be on guard. And I think there should be some type of, like, when we think of AARP and some of these insurance companies, even Medicare, right? That's a government entity, but they cater to our elderly. And I think as we're seeing cases like this, as we're seeing people get actively catfished and then scammed out of thousands of dollars, I've even seen a case that I covered on our paid content where a woman believed in DeSoto, Texas, that her daughter was kidnapped and her daughter was at the gymnastics facility. And so she had to rush to try to figure out. And putting these clues together, she finally came to the resolve that her daughter was at the gymnastics studio and was never kidnapped. But they asked her to like, get money and, kind of similar to this situation. And I think you have to be very careful to educate. I think education is the biggest deterrent here, right? Because we live in AI society where there can be things that are as real as a deep fake, where the person talking looks exactly like your family member, they make sound exactly like your family member, and without the proper education, you will fall for it. And typically because, if you're a millennial, you've grown up where you didn't always have the internet, but we were also immersed in the internet as well, right? We were the before and after of the internet. Well, with our demographic, we understand just because of education purposes and how active we are in social media that AI exists. But when you have people who are older and they don't understand it and they don't get it, and it appears to be real, it appears to be genuine, I think that your guard naturally comes down in those situations. And even in situations where you are educated, it can still happen, right? Like it
Absolutely.
doesn't even have to
Yeah.
be elderly because AI is so good. It's
Right.
so good and it's only getting better. And so I think education is the only real way to combat that scenario.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think also just having a healthy form of skepticism, right? Not believing everything just because they say it is, right? So that's really good stuff. I like that. Well, the prosecutors did believe that this shooting was unjustified. They believed that Brock was liable and they proceeded to take this case to trial. Now, at trial, the facts of the shooting was not disputed, right? So the central issue here, as Steph has already stated, whether the killing was legally justified as self-defense, because that's the argument that Brock and his defense attorneys raised. Because under Ohio law, a self-defense claim requires a few elements. They require that the defendant, one, did not initiate the situation. They didn't create it. They did not start the situation that ensued. So if we're analyzing this, we'll put our attorney hats on. Everybody put your attorney hat on, and we're analyzing this. We have element number one. The defendant did not create the situation. Okay, well, in this particular case, we can argue that Brock did not create this situation. He was faced with a woman that came to his door that was allegedly picking up a package. Okay. So, and then the second element is that they have to have a reasonable belief of imminent deadly harm. That means that they believe that there's deadly harm that is emergent. It's happening right here, right now. They can't escape it, right? And the belief has to be reasonable. And that's really where the gray sits, right, Steph? That's where lawyers will sit their hat and rest their case on this particular element. It's usually about whether or not that person's belief was reasonable. And then the last element is whether or not the force that was used was proportionate to the imminent danger that was upon them. So did Brock's use of his gun and shooting it and firing it 6 times, was that a reasonable or proportionate force? Was that force proportionate to the fear that he believed was imminent? And so, of course, the defense, they believe that yes, they were able to check. They believe they could check every element of self-defense in this case, and that's what they argue. They argue that Brock's fear was genuine. It was fueled by scam calls, his age, being an elderly person, and he perceived that when this woman, who they told him was going to show up at his doorstep, was going to be there, and he didn't give them what he was supposed to give them, that he was going to die, right? He was going to be killed. Now, the prosecution, they countered that fear alone is not enough, right? LoLetha was unarmed. She was outside and she was performing her job. On top of that, she was fleeing. She was not pursuing. And so that's what the prosecution argued. Brock escalating this encounter showed that he controlled it. And then his force, it wasn't proportionate. He used deadly force when there was non-lethal alternative options that existed, right? He could have fired the gun into the sky. He could have, said, get out of here. And if you don't get out of here right now, right, he could have picked up, a shovel. He could have threw rocks at, right? Like, we can all come up with a whole lot of different alternatives that the prosecution likely argued to the jury. And in this case, the jury did, in fact, reject self-defense, and they returned a guilty verdict with a life sentence. And I want to pause here for a second, because this is the part of the case that I'm still wrestling with. Not the verdict, not the sentence, but the argument itself. Because the defense didn't deny what happened. They argued fear. And legally, fear does matter, right? It matters as it relates to whether or not you can use defense. The law says self-defense. The law says fear has to be reasonable. Not just real, not just felt, but reasonable. And I keep asking myself, Steph, like, reasonable to who? Because I don't think anyone doubts that Brock was afraid. Fear can be genuine, fear can be overwhelming, fear can feel completely real to the person that's experiencing it. But the law doesn't stop at, did you feel afraid? It asks something just a little harder, right? It asks something that we don't want to wrestle with. It asks, would an ordinary person in those same circumstances have felt that imminent threat of deadly harm? And that's where I get stuck, because LoLetha's was unarmed. She identified herself. She was doing her job that she had been sent to do, and yet fear still was claimed by Brock. I'm not saying fear makes someone evil, and I'm not saying fear should be ignored, but I am saying fear doesn't come from nowhere. So fear is shaped, fear is learned, fear is influenced by what we've been taught in society, both consciously and unconsciously, about who is in danger, who is dangerous, and who is not. And that's uncomfortable to talk about, because nobody wants to believe that their fear might be influenced by some level of bias, especially implicit bias. The kind you don't choose, you don't announce, and you don't even realize it's operating. The law does try to protect against that idea of a reasonable person alone, because they're saying someone has to be objective, someone has to be neutral, but juries are not neutral by nature. We're human beings and we have subjective feelings.
The question becomes not accusatory, not rhetorical, just honest. When we say reasonable fear, are we always talking about facts, or are we sometimes talking about assumptions? Because fear based on conduct is one thing. Fear based on presence is something else entirely. And the reason this matters is because the stakes could not be higher. If fear alone were enough untethered from imminent threat, then the law would excuse too much. It would excuse panic, it would excuse prejudice, it would excuse deadly force based on what someone imagined might happen rather than what was actually happening. So we're not here to tell you what to think. We're sitting with the tension.
We're acknowledging that fear can be real and still not be reasonable under the law. And we want to leave you with the same question we're still asking ourselves about this case. If reasonable fear is supposed to be objective, what happens when the fear itself is shaped by implicit bias? So we want you to tell us what your thoughts are on that. But at the end of the day, in this case, LoLetha's family lost far more than a loved one. Her son, Mario Hall, has spoken about the lasting impact of her death, the grief, the anger, and the weight of knowing his mother died simply for going to work. Holidays are quieter, advice goes unanswered. These two talk every single day, all day long. And now it's silence. The future she was meant to be a part of is gone. While sentencing gave them a conclusion, he was sentenced to life without the possibility of her family was served with a permanent sentence of loss. Conviction is accountability, but it's not closure. And here, while one party, arguably the most responsible, was held accountable, the scammers were not. They still haven't been arrested, let alone identified. So, Steph, what's your takeaway from this case?
Takeaway is education. You know, I think the situation could have been avoidable if we really targeted teaching our first of all, let me say this. I believe education first starts in the home, right? And so if you as a young person have an elderly parent, it's your responsibility first to make sure that you're letting them know about scammers. And because I feel like that's a general pot that we talk about scammers, but you tell them the warning signs, you give them some key tools that they can use in order to avoid this situation. Because I do believe it was avoidable right from the beginning. And if you don't have those tools, then you're left vulnerable. And so I believe that we have to educate. And so I highly encourage anybody who's listening, if you have an elderly parent, your grandparents are still alive, make sure that you're giving them the tools that they need in order to avoid scammers because scammers are not usually from the United States. Just a tidbit. These scammers probably were over on the other side of the world operating from a call center. And in that case, there is no prosecution in that situation, in that scenario. And how these scammers, and this is just like information because I'm a documentary junkie, they usually get your information and who you are and who you're connected to from social media. So they go and they vet your page, eventually getting your information that is just readily available because we live in a digital age. And they're able to pinpoint your loved one, right, through your social media page. And so be very careful about what you're putting on your social media and just safeguard those spaces because we are so ready to just let everybody know what we doing, when we doing, how we do it, that there are people who are looking and actively seeking the vulnerable. And that starts, yes, with our elderly and our youth, but it's not to the exclusivity of us all. So that can happen to anybody. So I think to enable to safeguard yourself, you have to educate yourself. You have to know what's going on so that you can avoid what this situation evolved into being.
That takeaway, Steph, and I won't really add an additional takeaway because I honestly think that's probably the best takeaway from this case. What I will say is it's sometimes it's nice to have like, well, what's something tangible that I can be left with to like educate? How do I educate? What is something that I could do? And I know for my family in particular, my immediate family, we have a safe word. We have a word, you could do a phrase, whatever it is that will identify that this is who I am, because only the people in this house know it. And so if somebody calls me and says, well, I'm such and such, like, okay, what's our safe word? And if they don't know it, then I know it's not them, or I know it's probably not them, right? Like, it just those are some things that you can do, and you can Google what are some ways that I can protect, myself from scammers. What are some tools that I can use to immediately implement today to protect my family, my parents, my kids from these kinds of scams. But I definitely think in spite of the scam, this still could have been avoided. Like, Steph, you say this could have been avoided with education. I think even beyond that, Brock had some implicit bias that took his fear, according to the jury, to become unreasonable. Right. And I think we've got to tackle that too. So, and that's harder. It's harder to tackle those implicit bias, those bias that we don't even know we have. They're subconscious often, and they're taught from a very young age. But it's the way we can immediately start to tackle some change.
Yes. So that's our true crime case for today. Let us know what you think. by simply interacting with our posts on social media, or you can go over to Substack where we'll have a episode or a blog post dedicated to this episode, asking you questions in order to have a meaningful discussion that will hopefully make us all think differently about scammers, scam calls, and this situation in general. I want to encourage you that if you are listening to us on YouTube, go ahead and press that subscribe button. Keep up with us. We want to know what's going on and we want to keep you informed. And the best way to do that is to press that bell icon so that you'll be notified whenever we have a new short or whenever we have a new podcast episode. Join us on Substack so we can build community. Want to let you know that every week we drop a story time with Steph where we are going to cover stories that we don't often get to tell here on our main platform just because we only do podcasts once a week. But we want to be engaged with you. Make sure you stay in touch with us. And most importantly, leave us a 5-star review if you enjoy the work that you are hearing. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black.